Right. Hello, everyone. Can everyone see and hear me? Yes, looks like you can. Okay, good. Good, good, good. Okay, so today we've got to continue our talk about universals. Um, so last time we looked at the strong realism account of universals, where universals are sort of a mind independent thing that exist over and above um their particular instantiations. And of course, we talked about abstract reference and attribute agreement. We talked about Plato um, and the third man argument. So that's the important takeaways from last time. This time, we're going to get into conceptualism, nominalism, and moderate realism. So let me just share my screen so everyone can see the slides. Oh, and I guess today is also Halloween, isn't it? So happy Halloween, everyone. So far, there are not as many participants as usual, and I wonder if perhaps people were out Halloweening a little bit last night. I don't know. I saw some people in my neighborhood in costumes. So I don't know. Um, right. So compare the sort of strong realism about universals that we discussed last time to nominalism, which denies that there are universals. So nominalism, the word is kind of related to other words like noun, name. Um, and on nominalism, there are only individuals or particulars. Universals do not exist outside of language, that is. Right? We can talk about, um, I don't know, this apple being green, this house plant being green, this car being green, but there's no universal that exists mind independently over and above all those instantiations. It's only the various instantiations, the various greens, as it were, that exist. Now, this view is associated with William of Ockham, who I mentioned very briefly last time. But William of Ockham was a medieval philosopher from England, and you've probably heard of him by way of Occam's razor, right? Which means that, or usually the way it's given, is that the simplest answer uh, to some particular quandary is the correct one. That's one formulation. Another formulation is do not multiply entities beyond necessity. And here, entities means something like theoretical entities. So, um, I guess we could try and generate some examples. One would be one that I've already used technically when when we're employing abductive reasoning. So, say um, I hear a noise during the night, and then in the morning I come downstairs and my house plant has been knocked over, right? The simplest explanation, given that I have two cats that are very active at night, is that they were playing around and knocked the plant over, right? If I were to suppose that, I don't know, ghosts or gremlins or something knocked over the plant instead, I would be multiplying entities beyond necessity. I would be appealing to something, a theoretical entity, to explain the plant that's been knocked over that I don't need to, right? One example that I'm also familiar with is is from Jaegwon Kim in his book on the philosophy of mind, which don't worry about this. You don't have to go and read it, obviously, but um, this example involves a shop full of clocks. And the clocks are synchronized every day. Um, Now, who's synchronizing the clocks? Uh, could be the shopkeeper, could be a leprechaun or something, an invisible creature that comes out at night and synchronizes all the clocks, and that's why all the clocks are always in sync whenever a customer enters the clock shop. Of course, we'd be multiplying entities beyond necessity there. Um, Simply because we don't need a theoretical entity like a leprechaun in order to explain why all of the clocks are synchronized, right? We don't need a supernatural explanation when there's a natural explanation, for example. So, can we come up with any other examples of Occam's razor just to sort of clarify this point that when we talk about entities, we mean, well, what we really mean is theoretical entities. Maybe somebody can volunteer an example in the chat. Well, there is one example that's germane to what we're discussing today, in case we need a clue. Well, I guess I'll go ahead and tell you. So, um, remember, we have abstract reference and we have attribute agreement, right? We want to explain why all of these attributes, all of these examples of the color green, for example, agree with one another. Oh, we're just trying to come up with an example of Occam's razor. But it's okay. I'm going to just tell you a third one. Um, so we want to explain attribute agreement. How is it that how is it that all of these um, greens agree with one another, right? Kermit the Frog has the attribute of being green. This houseplant has the attribute of being green. A Granny Smith apple has the attribute of being green, and they all agree in their greenness, as it were. How do we explain this? Well, Plato might have posited the existence of some perfect form of green, right? That all of these objects sort of get their greenness from. But if we apply Occam's razor, um, it's simpler just to say, well, there is no universal green. There are just green individuals, but there's no universal over and above those individuals. Likewise with abstract reference, right? How is it that I'm able to talk about some property that all of these objects share over and above those objects? Like I'm able to refer to greenness separately from green objects. Well, again, it's just a quirk of language. It's not because there's some universal um, of greenness that exists over and above these objects, right? So if you're a nominalist like William of Ockham and you apply Occam's razor, uh, you would say that um, the believing in universals is multiplying entities beyond necessity. So is everybody following so far? Okay, good. Now there's a couple different kinds of nominalism. There's strict nominalism. So, strict nominalism says that when we use words that seem to refer to universals, we're really just referring to individuals. So, I could say something like, Kermit the Frog is green, the apple is green. I'm not actually referring to the universal or a universal, right? I'm actually just referring to green entities. This entity is green, that entity is green, etc. So how do we explain attribute agreement? Well, there isn't really anything to explain, right? It's just language. It's just the way language works. There are green objects, this one, that one, and these are basic metaphysical facts about those objects. Um, but there's no universal over and above that. It just maybe seems that way because of the way language operates, right? This is the way Quine puts it. And this is from page 158 of Crumley. He says, one may admit that there are red houses, roses, and sunsets, but deny, except as a popular and misleading manner of speaking, that they have anything in common. The words houses, roses, and sunsets are true of sundry individual entities, which are houses and roses and sunsets, and the word red or red object is true of sundry individual entities, which are red houses, red roses, red sunsets. But there is not, in addition, any entity whatever, individual or otherwise, which is named redness. That the houses and the roses and the sunsets are all of them red may be taken as ultimate and irreducible, and it may be held that the realist is no better off in point of real explanatory power for all the occult entities which he posits under such names as redness. So that's how Quine explains it. Now, so there's two claims going on from strict nominalists. Um, Strict nominalists say that they can explain things just as well as a strong realist can. Um, so we can explain attribute agreement and abstract reference. Perhaps explain away is a better term, right? Like, um, how is it that we're able to refer to green things or red things, as having this attribute in common with one another? Well, it's just a basic metaphysical fact that this house is red, this rose is red, this apple is green, this Muppet is green, etc. And there's nothing else to explain beyond that, right? So, an abstract reference, as Quine says, uh, it's just a sort of a popular and misleading manner of speaking, right? In that it leads us uh, to think that universals exist over and above particulars when really there are no such things. So that's the first claim. Um, they can explain things just as well as the realist can, or perhaps uh, explain away, depending on who you ask. And there are individual entities with the properties that they have, and that's it, right? There are red objects and there are green objects. There are um, virtuous characters, um, but that just means you've just got a virtuous individual, not that they are getting their virtue from some perfect form, right? Likewise with goodness, wisdom, beauty, etc., and all of those other forms that Plato believed in, right? So those are the claims of strict nominalism. Now, how would a realist respond? Hmm? Maybe my cat can tell me. He seems quite interested in this today. How could a realist respond? Well, they might say that strict nominalism doesn't really explain why our ordinary view is mistaken. And our ordinary view, by the way, is that universals exist. I guess if you're a realist, that's your ordinary view, right? Maybe resemblance nominalism can explain um, why this view is mistaken. Now, resemblance nominalism says that what we're doing when we, use these popular and misleading ways of speaking, in Quine's words, is that we're classifying individuals together because they resemble each other in some way. There's still no need for us to posit the existence of universals here. So, when I group green objects together, it's not because on resemblance nominalism that there is this universal, oh, excuse me, this universal of green or greenness. I'm just grouping green things like, unripened tomatoes and pears and Granny Smith apples together because they resemble each other in some way. And when I do this, what I'm doing is referring to what we call a resemblance class. So in terms of greenness, right? House plants, unripened tomatoes, Granny Smith apples, Kermit the Frog, all of these things resemble one another. And it's just a class of individuals that we group together by virtue of this resemblance, not by virtue of their sharing in some universal, of instantiating a universal. But what if we get the wrong classes? So Crumley's example is a dog, right? A realist might say there's a universal, say dog or dogness. Um, and a nominalist would say, well, that's not really a universal. That's just a matter of belonging to a class of certain kinds of beings with four legs, fur, descended from wolves or some cousin of the wolf, perhaps, right? Crumley puts it like this. He says, think of the variety of individuals within this class, right? An Irish setter, he writes, which resembles a golden retriever, which resembles a bulldog, which resembles the Terry Toons cartoon character Deputy Dog, which resembles creatures from the infamous Star Wars bar scene, one of which resembles a Yorkshire Terrier, which resembles a cat a former neighbor once owned. A cat? Right? So, excuse my typo down here, but where do we draw the line between classes if our classes are based on resemblance? So, do you see the idea here, right? Like, we understand, going with the dog example, that um, um, that we group all of these creatures together if we're resemblance nominalists, that is, we group them all together based on resemblance, but some dogs don't really resemble other dogs very closely, right? So where do we draw the line, right? If we draw the line on resemblance, there's a worry that certain dogs might be excluded, or that some creatures that are not dogs might be included in our idea of dog, right? Well, so the reason why cat gets in there is because there might be a cat that resembles a dog, basically, is what Crumley is saying. We can try and sort of flesh this out with another example, like mammal, right? How do we delineate the class mammal if they all if we're doing it by resemblance? Um, do we do it by physical resemblance? Well, if we did that, then we might exclude some creatures, right? We might count well, it's not based on appearance, it's based on resemblance, which may or may not be appearance based. So If we were to do it by appearance, then our class of mammal might include lots of furry creatures, but it might not include whales, even though whales biologically are mammals, right? So, so what we have to do is make sure we're looking at the right characteristics. And of course, mammals do all resemble one another um, by virtue of the fact that they're warm-blooded. They give birth to live young. They produce milk to feed the young. Yeah, Quinn, that's exactly where I was going with this. If you so if you do it that way, then you say, well, what about a duck-billed platypus, right? It lays eggs, it's got a weird bill. Um, in fact, when Europeans first brought back samples of life forms from the southern hemisphere, they brought back the platypus, and the naturalists back home thought it was some kind of prank, right? They were like, "What is this? You've obviously sewn this together from parts of other creatures." And no, no, it's a real creature, and it turns out it's a mammal. I believe so, Amy. I'm not a biologist, but I believe it does. So, so what kind of resemblances, right? Yeah, what is a mammal? Well, they might be, but it's important because remember we want to know we're into the metaphysics part of this stuff, right? Where we want to know what kinds of things exist and what those things are like, right? And we want to know if universals exist. And it might seem like splitting hairs if we're talking about colors or mammals, but what if I'm talking about something like right or wrong? Um, right? If I'm talking about uh uh goodness or the good, um I want to know the nature of that, right? Is it a universal, or do we just kind of categorize, classify good acts together based on the resemblance between certain features of the acts? If so, how are we classifying? And it can seem like splitting hairs because, in a sense, scientists have already done a lot of this for us in the natural world, right? When it comes to the natural world, um, we've already figured out, what's a mammal, what's a reptile, what's an amphibian, right? But when it comes to more abstract things, it's a little bit trickier. So, how do we draw the line between our different classes? How do we make sure that things like the whales and the platypuses and the echidnas are in the proper classes? Um, we might appeal to something like Ludwig Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblance. So he was a 20th century Austrian philosopher, and he thought, kind of like the nominalists, that we could make a sense of a lot of these problems if we just thought a little bit more about the way that we speak, the way that we use language. In fact, sometimes we call Wittgenstein's work ordinary language philosophy, especially his later stuff, because it's very sort of focused on um, the way people speak, the way people use language, which for Wittgenstein tells you a lot about the way that people think. And he seems to be kind of a nominalist. Oh, interesting. Okay, so there's a subgroup of mammals. Well, kind of like how there are subgroups of mammals, like there are all kinds of subclasses of mammals. Then they're a special kind, I suppose, that lay eggs. But of course, there are other kinds too, right? There are canids and there are felids and there are cetaceans and many other kinds of mammals. and they're all a little bit different, but they all do have something in common. So if you're Wittgenstein, you're probably a nominalist. Um, and it's really the way we use language, and it's not the existence of universals that dictates uh, how we classify things by resemblance. Well, in a way, at least when it comes to the natural world, Quinn, I mean, scientists have kind of done that, right? But let's not worry too much about animals and so forth. Just because what we're really interested in is the big metaphysical picture here, right? Um, so how does Wittgenstein explain this notion of family resemblance? He uses games. So what is it that games have in common that make them games? Let's go through it now. So what are some games? I need some games. It is. It is easy to get on a tangent. Uno, yes, a game. And let's talk about the characteristics of these games as we go, right? So Uno is played with cards. Mousetrap and Monopoly have boards, right? Chess, which has board but also pieces. And then we've got a lot of things here. Let me increase the size of this window. Yu-Gi-Oh! Yeah, cards, Civilization, so computer game, blackjack, cards, Fortnite, computer, checkers, another board game, turn-based games, yes. Tetris is a computer game, of course. Wii Sports, Ticket to Ride, I've never heard of this. Connect Four doesn't really use a board, but it uses some kind of apparatus, right? Volleyball, which takes place on a court. Crazy Eights, yeah. So these are all really great examples. These are all games, but they're all pretty different from one another, right? I mean, some of them are closer to each other than they are to others. The Hunger Games, right? Um, so so yeah, like chess and checkers have different rules, different kinds of pieces, but they're played on quite similar boards, right? So it's easy to see the resemblance there. But those games are also quite different from games that we play with your typical deck of 52 playing cards, like Crazy Eights or Blackjack, right? And those games are quite different from, I don't know, something like Fortnite, right? Where you're on the computer and you're doing whatever you do in Fortnite. I guess it's well, what are you doing? You're making a little fort and trying to defend it, like kind of like capture the flag sort of thing. I'm showing my age here, but yeah, I actually have not played Fortnite. I haven't played a video game in forever, actually. I'm too busy. Um, they crank 90s. Um, well, very good. I don't quite understand what that means, but sure. Okay, well, that's a great example. Like in chess, the object of the game is to put the opponent's king in checkmate. In checkmate, in Fortnite, perhaps it is to crank 90s. So very different objectives for the games, right? Yeah, is there some kind of Fortnite yeah, okay, so it's like Hunger Games, you have to kill everyone. Okay. So it's like a King of the Hill, capture the flag shooter kind of thing. That's fun. That sounds fun. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, like a survival game. Yeah. So yeah, well, all these are all pretty different from one another, right? And of course, Wittgenstein probably had fewer games. Um, there was certainly no Fortnite, no Hunger Games, but there were your typical games, everything from chess to backgammon to football. And Wittgenstein would say that games form a family. Some games resemble other games, and these games resemble yet other games, which may not necessarily resemble yet other games, but do resemble different games, kind of like members of a family. So this is family resemblance. So it's kind of like, I look a bit like um I look a bit like my parents, a bit like each of my parents. Um and uh and my cousins kind of all look a bit like their parents. But my cousins and I don't look alike, right? That's family resemblance, right? Same with games. And that's what Wittgenstein is saying here. Games form a family. And this is the same, for all of the things that we think of as, that we might class as universals or class according to resemblance. It's because of this family resemblance. Um, some people, like Bambra here, claim that by invoking family resemblance, Wittgenstein actually solved the debate between realists and nominalists. I don't know about that. But at the very least, family resemblance does explain how we group together various individuals. There are overlapping similarities in terms of the way we talk about these things, in terms of the way we think about them, right? Sometimes these are called cluster concepts. Crumley doesn't really talk about this, but well, really, I mean, if you want to think of it this way, Remy, like family resemblance is Wittgenstein's take on a resemblance class. So it's like there's something we can do. We can be resemblance nominalists and we can place things in a resemblance class. And Wittgenstein would say that works because of this family resemblance. So it's just sort of really the same sort of thing. Like Wittgenstein's family resemblance is a particular way of explaining how we group together things into a resemblance class. So they're not really that different, right? It's just like the family resemblance is a means of putting together resemblance classes that's available to us. It's kind of thanks to the way that we speak and the way that we think. Because for Wittgenstein, um, language is your world, right? Language sets the limits of what you can think about. If you can't talk about it, you can't think about it for Wittgenstein, right? So, um, another way, well, it's just that for Wittgenstein, language is, I mean, like I said a moment ago, language is what enables us to think in a sort of important sense, right? Like, so because we have language and because we can think, that's what enables us to pick out, I don't know, visual similarities between objects or conceptual similarities, right? Like when we talk about the family resemblance between games, some of that is just, the physical features, like, lots of different games are played using playing cards. And we can look and see that, right? Like, oh, you like think of how many kinds of poker you can play with playing cards. There's like endless varieties of poker that you can play, right? Um, but poker is also conceptually pretty different from chess or rugby, right? Yeah, that's right, Remy. Wittgenstein doesn't really talk about symbolic representations, but somebody, a modern day sort of contemporary cognitive scientist would say that. I think that, as Remy says in the chat, like I can exchange symbolic representations, and those symbolic representations ultimately are mental representations, right? So yeah, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because we're going to talk about this kind of thing when we talk about the mind. Um, but you can also think of family resemblance, or what Wittgenstein calls family resemblance in terms of uh, uh, cluster concepts. So the classical view of concepts has it that we define what things are by positing necessary and sufficient conditions. Right? So to be a fruit, um you need to, I don't know, grow on a plant, contain seeds, um well, what else? It's hard to think of something essential for being the fruiting body of a plant, but yeah, growing off of a plant, producing seeds, um maybe being edible, right? And that's, we could try and sort of outline the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a fruit. Being uh but Wittgenstein would just say, look at all these things that we call fruits, right? Like apples, bananas, pears, tomatoes. Uh Really, this is just a cluster concept. Some of them share features with other fruits, with these ones, but not with these ones. Like a lot of fruits are sort of generally speaking round, like apples and berries, but not all of them. You've also got pineapples and bananas that are strangely shaped, right? But we still count them as fruits. Um, so that is the idea behind cluster concepts, and it's closely related to this notion of family resemblance. Oh, another thing we can talk about are tropes. So in philosophy, tropes aren't like um, the things we encounter in media. Like one trope I talk about a lot because I I'm very interested in robotics and artificial intelligence, is that trope where robots rebel and kill all of the humans, right? That's a trope in the media study sense. But in philosophy, tropes are individual token-like things. So, what is a token? Well, first you need to understand what a type is. Types are categories. So, dogs, cats, cars, plants, furniture, right? And tokens are examples from those categories. So there is a type of creature, a class of creature that we call dog. And sitting here on the couch beside me is a token of that type. That is my dog. Um, We can think of tropes as particularized properties too. Like if we think of my cats who are not um, here at the moment, but one of them, the one who was here earlier, has a short hair and orange and white fur. Um, the other has long orange fur. So particularized properties. Those would be um, those would be like tropes, individual token-like things. Um, yeah, because these cats are brothers, the shade of orange is pretty much the same. So it's two tropes. The trope of the orange of each cat's fur. If we appeal to tropes to explain resemblance, then what we're doing is being trope resemblance nominalists. So the trope that constitutes the short-haired cat's orange fur resembles the trope that constitutes the other cat's long orange fur. Now, this is getting pretty complicated, right? So a realist might come along and say, this explanation is really not any simpler than ours because you need to posit the existence of so many tropes. And maybe universals have even snuck back in, right? Bertrand Russell argued that when it comes to nominalists, all of them, all nominalists, whether they're strict nominalists or resemblance nominalists or trope resemblance nominalists, have to admit that there exists one universal, and that is resemblance. Resemblance sounds like a universal to Bertrand Russell. Well, because tropes are individual things. So there's not, in the case of the cats, there's not a universal orange. There's just this trope, that trope, that trope, and like so on ad infinitum. But then you still have to explain how all of the tropes resemble one another. Kind of like if you think back to the third man argument, right? Like if you have a set of large objects and the form of largeness, you need another form to explain how the large objects are related to the form. And then you need another form to explain how that form relates the first form to the set of objects. And here Russell is saying, well, you can have all these tropes, all these or everything, or you can be a resemblance nominalist, whatever. Like you have to admit that there is at least one universal, which is resemblance, in order to explain how all of these particular things are related to one another. Yeah, well, you're right, Amy, but then like how are the instances of orange related, right? How are they all what do they all have in common that makes them all orange, right? Okay, let us refill the coffee and then talk about moderate realism. So I will just be right back. I'm just going to refill the coffee. Oh. Okay, that's better. So, moderate realism. This comes to us from Aristotle, and what it says is that universals exist, but not over and above or separately from the objects that instantiate them. Rather, they exist in the objects themselves. So remember that Aristotle was Plato's greatest student, and moderate realism is one way that Plato or that Aristotle departs from the teachings of Plato, because of course Plato was a strong realist. Well, that's kind of what Bertrand Russell was saying. He's saying like, these nominalists who deny the existence of universals still have to admit that resemblance, whatever that is, sounds an awful lot like a universal. Mm. So, um, now I'm really departing from the way Crumley does things here. So it's helpful if you've read the chapter, but just pay attention to this in case it's on the test, the next quiz. So Aristotle is a hylomorphist. So hylomorphism means something like matter formness. It comes from like hule, which is matter, and morphe, which is form. So if we can understand how matter and form are put together, we can understand the essence of a thing, according to Aristotle. Now remember, Plato thinks that the forms are more real than particular entities. So, right, like in the slides, I use the example of a chair. There might be a perfect form of a chair, which is more perfect than any chair. But last time we talked about triangles, right? Plato is Remember, Plato's educated in the Pythagorean tradition, like Pythagoras, the same, the Pythagorean theorem. So Plato is brought up in very like immersed in geometry, right? And he even says in the Republic that um, before you can study philosophy, you've got to study, among other things, geometry. So he's doing geometry, drawing triangles and different polygons, and he has the idea of a perfect triangle, even though he can't actually draw one. So the idea is that um, all of the triangles we could ever produce on our slates, in the sand, wherever, get their reality from this perfect triangle, right? And that is a form. That's a perfect form. But Aristotle says that um, we grasp the intelligible form of individuals using our intellect, our nous, and we do this via abstraction. So we extract away particular features until we're left with this intelligible form, which is a universal, but it doesn't exist separately um, uh, from the individual, right? We might be able to make this clearer by looking a bit further into his theory of causality. So, for Plato, um, right, things get their reality from the perfect forms, right? Um, if you've read this, think back to the allegory of the cave, right? The prisoners um, are sort of chained up, staring at a wall down in this cave. And there's a fire behind them, and between them and the fire, there's a sort of wall, and things are being carried across this wall, and they're casting shadows on the wall of the cave, that is. And the people who are chained there think the shadows are what are really real, but the forms are what are more real, and things in on the wall of the cave are merely shadows, mere appearances that are cast by the forms. Same with things in our world, Plato would say, just mere appearances that get their reality, what little reality they have from the forms, which are like the most real things. Um, oh, for Aristotle, I'm hesitant to say that because I think Aristotle would say there's a right way to do this. And we can use our intellect to arrive at the real essence, to understand the real essence of things. Yeah, no, I don't think he would say that. Aristotle would say that reason would show you what's right, and if you don't agree, then it's because you're irrational or something like that. Um, so, um, So that's Plato. Now Aristotle has a very different theory of causality, or a very different theory of the forms, which we can kind of get an idea of by looking at his theory of causality. When we talk about causality, we usually mean like physical causal chains, right? Like A causes B causes C. The overused example is a game of pool, right? The cue stick strikes the cue ball, which strikes the eight ball, which rolls into the corner pocket, something like that. So we usually think of causality in terms of these causal chains. But Aristotle has four causes. So take the cast of Zeus, a bronze cast of Zeus. It has a material cause, and that is the material from which it's made, bronze. It could be just a lump of bronze that somebody has melted down and then cast into the shape of Zeus's head, right? Um, and then it has a formal cause, the form it takes, and that's again the form of Zeus. It has an efficient cause, and that is the person who brought it into being. And then the final cause, or the telos, which is what is the purpose of this bronze cast? Maybe it's for decoration, maybe it's a paperweight, right? What is it for? That's its final cause. Now, you can see here from this theory that the intelligible form is in the entity, it's in the individual for Aristotle, right? And this is why Aristotle is considered or called his idea is called hylomorphism, because to explain this thing, we need the matter and the form, right? To have this very bust of Zeus, you need the bronze, and the bronze has to take a particular form. Um, Without the bronze, the form is just an idea in someone's head. And without the idea, the bronze is just a lump of bronze, right? So that's why Aristotle is a hylomorphist, right? Matter formless. Yeah. Well, the intelligible form is the formal cause. So the formal cause is the intelligible form. And it's in the bust of Zeus. That's what Aristotle would say. You could say that the universals are like immanent, right? They're not like transcendent. They're not like over and above everything else like they are for Plato. They're in the things. They're in the individuals. So that's moderate realism, and it shares some similarities with conceptualism, which comes from Peter Abelard. Now, he's actually been interpreted differently by different thinkers. Um, some consider him to be a moderate realist, some consider him to be a kind of nominalist, and some, like Crumley does here, treat him as a conceptualist. So we'll treat him as a conceptualist too. And some of you are already, I think, kind of gravitating towards something like this, right? Where universals are concepts, so mental items, sort of like mental blueprints, right? And they exist in the mind, and they can refer to non-mental objects, sure, but maybe what concepts are like mental particulars. They can refer to multiple particular individuals. Um, One thing that we can say for certain, whether we take Abelard as a conceptualist or as I don't know, like a nominalist of some kind, or even a moderate realist, he's certainly not a strong realist. Um, he's saying universals are not mind independent, right? Universals, rather than being in the object and being grasped by the intellect, as Aristotle would say, Abelard would say, well, the universals are in my mind. They're concepts, they're ideas that I have. They're not in the objects. They're in my mind. So he's definitely not a strong realist. And if he's a moderate realist, well, he's a weird one. He's not like Aristotle. Um, so I guess that's the main difference between Aristotle and Abelard. Intelligible form for Aristotle is in the object, and we can grasp it with the intellect. But for Abelard, it's a concept in your mind or in my mind. One thing he has in common with Aristotle, though, is that we discover these concepts by abstracting. So I abstract away all the individual differences between particulars that I'm classing together, and I see what's left. So, we could do this again for a class like mammals, right? If we abstract away all the differences, like sure, platypuses lay eggs, but they also produce milk, right? So that's the one thing that all mammals have in common, or maybe they're also warm-blooded. But maybe we abstract away all the differences, like okay, whales have fins, apes have hands, platypuses have weird duck bills. Okay, sure, let's get rid of all those differences. What's left? Well, they're warm-blooded, they produce milk. And um that is ultimately what the concept of mammal boils down to, right? And again, these universals are not immanent, right? They don't exist in the things. They exist in the mind of the thinker. You could, but we just haven't decided to do that. And I'm sure scientists argued a lot about this, right? Like, another example, actually, which probably might work a little better for our purposes than the mammal example, would be planets. So is Pluto a planet? When I was young, it was. Quinn says it's not, but it should be. Yeah, what was it? 2007? Yeah, too small. 2006. Yeah, I knew it was around there because I remember that was well, geez, 2006. That's right before I started university. But yeah, um is it a planet? Is it not a planet? Some scientists say that it should be, and some say no, it shouldn't, right? It should be a dwarf planet. Amy says it's a dwarf planet, and the issue, if we consider it a planet, we will have to make all the other ones planets as well. That's right. Um, and there are lots of objects that are around the same size as Pluto out there, way, way beyond the orbit of Neptune. And we don't think of them as planets. It's just that we knew about Pluto first, and we thought, oh, okay, here's this really tiny planet all the way out there. But now it turns out that there are lots of similar objects like that, and even in the inner solar system, you have dwarf planets like Ceres, right? Um, Karen, born in 2006, elementary school, they still told us it was a planet. Oh yeah, maybe. Well, it takes a while for, the scientific knowledge to propagate through the education system, right? Aren't there also moons that are about the same size? Yeah, the largest moon in the solar system is Titan, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody should hop on Google and correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, the largest moon is Titan. It's a moon of Saturn. But somebody please fact check me. What I'm fairly confident about is that Titan is bigger than Pluto, though. Oh, it is Ganymede. Oh, okay. So that's a moon of Jupiter. Oh, wow. Okay, so it's pretty big. I guess I think I always thought it was Titan because, Titan, big Titan. Okay, thank you, Chloe. Yeah, thanks, Quinn, Aiden, Chloe, Jonah. Yeah, Ganymede and Titan are bigger than Pluto and Mercury. Yeah. So, yeah, there are moons that are larger than Pluto. But then again, does that mean that Mercury should be a dwarf planet? Right? See, here we're getting into the family resemblance stuff again, right? Which I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole, but you can see the idea, right? But but here we might be abstracting away all of the differences, um, all of the differences between planets, moons, and dwarf planets, and trying to classify them that way. Okay, so are there some examples we can generate to try and uh, better highlight the differences between moderate realism and conceptualism? Or even, yeah, you could define it that way. But then again, I don't know. I think dwarf planet is good enough. Just a small planet. And then maybe there are like, well, we already say that there are like giant planets, right? Like the gas giants. So there are dwarf planets and giant planets. Um, and then there are like I guess planets that are kind of not too big or too small, like the Earth or Mars or Venus, which is, nearly the exact same size as Earth. Yeah, well, look at see, this is the like Chloe, you're right. Like, yeah, like Jupiter and Saturn are like a very different kind of planet from Earth. So I don't know. I'm just saying like this is tricky, right? And ultimately this is why philosophers are concerned with, the very abstract details of all of this. Right? Um Scientists are looking at the concrete things like studying the planets and studying the mammals. Where philosophers are like, what kinds of things are there? Are universals a thing, or is it all particulars? Right? Yeah. Well, somewhat. But yeah, like, is everyone clear on the differences between all of these things, especially moderate realism and conceptualism? Okay, so what are we lost about? And I'll try and reiterate some of the points. So moderate realism. Oh, okay, moderate realism, easy. Yeah. So to understand moderate realism, contrast it with strong realism. So strong realism says that when I'm talking about a universal, right? Like when I'm talking about attribute agreement or when I'm making an abstract reference, I'm referring to something that exists independently of my mind over and above all the particular green things. Say I'm talking about things that are green, right? Kermit the Frog, Granny Smith apple, broccoli, um, all of these things are individuals that are green, but what explains their agreeing and their attribute of greenness, and what explains my ability to refer to green in the abstract, is that there is a universal that exists over and above these green objects. Now, moderate realism says that the universal exists, but it doesn't exist separately from the objects. It's in the objects themselves. Yeah, Kara says universals are mental concepts on conceptualism. That is true. Moderate realism, universals are in the objects themselves, independent of one's mind. Yes, that is accurate. Yeah, conceptualism is in our mind. Well, the concepts are in our mind, right? So, and that's the difference between moderate realism and conceptualism. Like Aristotle, the moderate realist would say universals exist mind independently and they are in the objects. Um, but Abelard, the conceptualist, would say universals do not exist mind independently. They are concepts in your mind. Yeah, that's right, Chloe. Like you could have a universal like a Platonist or like a strong realist would say like the universal like the form of the good would exist even if there were no people around to be good, right? It would say that the form of odd and even number exists even if there are no objects to count, right? That's what that's what a strong realist would say. And in moderate realism, as you say, that's not the case. We need the objects because the universals exist within the objects. So on strong realism, universals exist separately from the objects. On nominalism, universals don't exist. It's just the way we talk. Moderate realism, universals exist, but in the objects. And conceptualism, universals exist, but in the mind. That's the way I would break down the key differences here. Okay, and that's really all I have for today. Yeah, very good, very good. Yeah, like, you know, I mean, this stuff is all quite abstract, right? So it takes a bit of it's almost like you have to practice thinking about it. And by practice, I mean you have to keep thinking about it over and over again to get the hang of thinking about things in the abstract, right? Because philosophy is very abstract. The last part, so I think what you mean, Justina, is the differences between the four things we've covered in this chapter. So, um, a strong realist would say universals exist separately from individuals, kind of like over and above the individuals. A nominalist would say universals don't exist. It's just the way we speak that makes us think that they exist. And if we apply Occam's razor, well, we really shouldn't posit the existence of universals. Um, Moderate realists like Aristotle would say universals exist, but in the object. So, like my coffee cup has the property of solidity. Um, So solidity is universal, but it doesn't exist separately from the cup. It's in the cup, it's immanent. And then there's conceptualism, where Abelard would say universals exist in the mind as concepts, not in the world over and above objects or not in the objects. And that is basically the sort of overall framework of this chapter, right? When we abstract away yeah, you're welcome, Justina. For Chloe's question, when we abstract, we're abstracting away certain features, right? Think back to the planets, right? What do they all have in common? To find out what they all have in common with one another, we need to abstract away the differences between them. That means just sort of we subtract the concrete features so we get more abstract. So like think of all the planets, not counting Pluto, of course. So Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars are all terrestrial. They're made of rocks and metals and stuff. Okay. So, but the others are made of gases and ices. So, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune are very different from the terrestrial worlds in that sense. They're much larger and they're made of different things. They all have rings, right? Um, okay, so let's get rid of those differences. So forget about the size difference, forget about the composition difference. What do they have in common? Well, they're more or less spherical and they orbit the sun. So that what we're doing there is subtracting away concrete properties and kind of coming up with an abstract understanding of what a planet is, which might be like spherical object that orbits a star, right? So that's what we mean by abstraction. Does that make sense to you, Chloe? Yeah. Or like, abstracting the category dog, right? Like if you think of all the dogs you've ever seen, we'll take away all the particular properties that each individual dog has. Like my dog is pretty small, but my neighbors have a dog that's pretty big. What do they have in common besides, if we take away the difference in size, what are the similarities? Well, they've got four legs and fur and they bark. Of course, this isn't a perfect approach. Some dogs don't have fur. Some dogs don't bark. Um, right? Like my sister has sled dogs. She has like Siberian Huskies, right? Huskies don't actually bark. They roo and they howl, but they don't bark, right? So are they not dogs? Well, no, of course they're dogs. But they don't bark. Um, so that's where maybe the family resemblance approach can come into play, make things a bit simpler for us. But that's really it. So that's it for universals. Next time we're going to be talking about things. So we've talked about universals. The next chapter is going to be about individuals or particulars. And it's fun. It's still going to be very abstract, very metaphysical, but I'll try and make it as painless as possible. But does anyone have any other questions before we go? Because we are ending things a little bit early. Oh, well, like 5 minutes early. It's no big deal, but okay. You can email me as well if you're worried about the essay. Um, I'm trying for the end of the week. The TAs and I are working on, trying for the end of the week. Um, so Friday, maybe over the weekend, although I'm really trying to get it done for Friday. Well, no, I mean, why don't you email me and I can see what I can do to try and give you some assistance. Or we could maybe set up a meeting. Yeah, like just send me an email. We'll figure something out. We'll set up some office hours and 'cause yeah, I get it. Like sometimes you can spend a lot of time spinning your wheels trying to get started on an assignment like this. Um and it can be frustrating. I certainly appreciate that. Um yeah. Yeah, Tyler, that's another problem that some people have. But yeah, like you say, once you get writing, you should be okay. For the people that are having trouble generating topics, I mean, I guess it's probably okay if you're really stuck. I know I like to discourage the use of Google and generative AI, but if you're really stuck, you could Google some good ideas for a first year philosophy class, or you could ask ChatGPT. um, Now you absolutely cannot use ChatGPT to help you write the paper, okay? I want to be absolutely clear about that. But I tried this in my other class where I was like, hey, give me five essay topics for a first year philosophy essay on consciousness, because my other class is on consciousness. And it generated five pretty decent ideas. But if you do that, you need to acknowledge that you've done that. You need to put a little footnote and says like that says something like, "Oh, I came up with this idea using AI, right? Like I wrote the paper myself, but I got this from a list of topics that I got from the internet or from AI or something." That's probably okay. That's like the only use of ChatGPT I'm going to allow. Um Yeah, maybe you're yeah. Well, Tyler, you try that and no, I mean, if like keep trying, but also let's meet and hash it out because I might be able to help you turn the idea into to frame it in terms of a research question if that's what you want to do. Okay, I guess that's everything. So I should get going to get to another class up on campus. Um, so, as always, everybody, let me know if you have any questions at any time about anything, and I hope you all have a fun Halloween, a fun and safe Halloween if you're doing anything tonight. And I'll see you all next week. All right. Bye for now, everyone.